Ann-Margret has finally revealed the truth Elvis could never bring himself to tell Priscilla. For decades, fans clung to the image of Graceland as a perfect love story, the king of rock and roll with his young bride, building a fairy tale marriage under the flashbulbs of the world. But behind the gates, another woman haunted that union, a woman who didn't just share the stage with Elvis, but his heart. Now Ann-Margret admits what really happened during those years. That Elvis carried a secret he whispered only to her, a truth about his marriage to Priscilla that changes everything we thought we knew. Was his love story with Priscilla ever whole, or was it always overshadowed by the bond he shared with Ann-Margret? When Elvis Presley first met Ann-Margret in 1964, it was on the glittering set of Viva Las Vegas. The cameras caught fire as soon as they began rehearsing together. But what no one expected was that the chemistry would leap so easily from the screen into real life. Elvis had shared stages and sets with dozens of women before, yet Ann-Margret was different. She matched him beat for beat, charisma for charisma. Their dance sequences weren't just choreographed. They were alive, pulsing with energy that made even the crew stop and stare. What happened between them wasn't the usual Hollywood flirtation. Elvis had always been careful to keep work and private life separate, especially with Priscilla waiting back at Graceland. Yet with Ann-Margret he dropped his guard. On set he would linger between takes just to talk with her. They laughed easily, shared the same mischievous sense of humor, and both carried the weight of rapid stardom. That connection forged a kind of trust that Elvis rarely allowed. Ann-Margret was also fiercely independent, something that fascinated Elvis. Most of the women in his orbit were either controlled by his inner circle or overshadowed by his fame. Ann-Margret didn't need him to shine. She was already a star in her own right, rising fast in Hollywood, praised not only for her beauty but also for her raw talent as a performer. Elvis saw in her a reflection of his own hunger and drive. She wasn't intimidated by him, and that made their bond electric. People who witnessed them together spoke of the unspoken signals. A glance across the stage, a hand brushed just a little too long, a private smile that carried more weight than words. They shared late-night conversations after filming Wrapped, talking about dreams, fears, and the pressures of fame. Unlike others around him, Ann-Margret didn't see Elvis only as the king. She saw the man underneath, vulnerable, restless, and aching for something deeper. Yet this connection carried shadows. Everyone around Elvis knew he had someone waiting at home. Priscilla had left her family in Germany, moved into Graceland as a teenager, and had been molded into the role of his future wife. She was the woman Elvis's family and manager wanted by his side. But Ann-Margret was the woman who actually understood the contradictions tearing at him. That tension created the beginnings of a triangle no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. The press, of course, noticed. Gossip columns speculated about their closeness, hinting at a romance that neither confirmed nor denied. Photographs of them together only fueled the stories. For Elvis's management, this was a nightmare. They had carefully constructed the image of Elvis as committed to Priscilla, with a stable home life that balanced out his wild rock and roll persona. Ann-Margret's presence threatened that illusion. Still, Elvis didn't care. He kept inviting her back, on stage, on tours, and even into his inner circle. To those closest to him, it became clear that Ann-Margret wasn't just a passing fling or a co-star he admired. She represented something more dangerous, a woman who touched the part of him that longed for freedom, honesty, and an equal partner. This was the spark that lit everything that followed. Because while the world would go on celebrating Elvis's marriage to Priscilla as a fairy tale, the reality was already compromised. Ann-Margret had stepped into his life and carved out a space he couldn't let go of. And as much as Elvis tried to balance both worlds, the devoted husband-to-be and the man enthralled by another woman, he knew even then that the truth would eventually demand to be faced. But what did that mean for Priscilla? Waiting quietly at Graceland, sensing a rival she could never escape. That shadow, unspoken yet undeniable, would haunt her for years, and it began long before the wedding bells ever rang. While Elvis was dazzling audiences with Ann-Margret in Hollywood, Priscilla Beaulieu was living a very different reality behind the closed gates of Graceland. She had moved into his world as a teenager, leaving behind her family in Germany to become part of a carefully shaped future. For years she was groomed by Elvis's inner circle to be the perfect bride, molded to fit the expectations of his career, his fans and his family. On the surface it was a dream, a young girl chosen by the most famous man in the world. But the reality was far more complicated. Priscilla's life inside Graceland was one of isolation. While Elvis toured, filmed, and surrounded himself with an ever-changing crowd of friends and admirers, Priscilla often remained at home. She was not part of the professional whirlwind that consumed Elvis, and she rarely joined him on set or in Las Vegas. Instead, she was expected to wait, to be the constant presence he could return to. Yet every time she opened a magazine or switched on the television, she saw Ann-Margret by his side, glowing, confident, and every bit his equal in the spotlight. That contrast was hard to ignore. Priscilla was confined, sheltered, and dependent, while Ann-Margret embodied independence, success, and visibility. Where Priscilla represented stability, Ann-Margret symbolized excitement. It was a painful imbalance. Elvis's management may have promised Priscilla that she was the woman who mattered most, but the evidence in the media told a different story. The headlines speculated about romance, the photographs suggested closeness, and whispers from inside the industry trickled back to her. The more Elvis worked with Ann-Margret, the more the shadow grew. Even when Elvis reassured Priscilla, there was an unspoken doubt. Ann-Margret had what Priscilla could never claim: a role in Elvis's professional life, a shared stage and a partnership that looked natural to anyone watching. The image of them performing together burned itself into the public imagination, a chemistry too real to dismiss. For Priscilla, those images weren't just publicity. They were reminders that she was competing with a bond she could not match. Friends later remembered how Priscilla often felt excluded. Elvis would come home from a day on set glowing with stories about Ann-Margret, the scenes they filmed, the songs they rehearsed. For Priscilla, it was another reminder that part of his life belonged to someone else. She wanted desperately to be seen as his partner, but in those years, she was more spectator than equal. The carefully constructed illusion of the perfect bride began to show cracks. Even before Elvis and Priscilla were married, this tension was eroding the foundation of their relationship. When they eventually walked down the aisle in 1967, the public saw a fairy tale, but privately the doubts were already present. Priscilla carried the weight of insecurity, sensing that Ann-Margret would always be a presence in Elvis's heart. That feeling never truly disappeared. This is the part of the story that Ann-Margret's later revelations confirmed. Elvis had admitted to her that his feelings went beyond friendship, that the bond they shared was one he could never completely sever. For Priscilla, even if she didn't know the full extent, the suspicion was enough. She lived with the knowledge that she was not the only woman who understood Elvis, and that was a wound that shaped the course of their marriage. And so, long before the divorce, long before the public unraveling, the shadow had already fallen. Priscilla would never be free of it, no matter how hard she tried to preserve the image of a perfect union. But what exactly did Elvis confess to Ann-Margret in private? The words that made clear where his heart truly lay. That was the secret he could never tell Priscilla, and it changed everything. To the public, Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret were simply co-stars who lit up the screen. But behind the scenes, she became something much more: the one person he trusted with his most vulnerable thoughts. Elvis had grown up surrounded by handlers, fans, and family who all had their own expectations of him. Rarely did he open himself up fully, afraid that any admission of weakness would become gossip or be used against him. With Ann-Margret, it was different. She was living through the same whirlwind, navigating sudden fame and the crushing demands of stardom. She didn't need him to explain. she understood. Their conversations stretched late into the night during Viva Las Vegas. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, away from the bright lights, Elvis confided his deepest fears. He told Ann-Margret about the pressures that came with being the king, the crushing weight of living up to an image he hadn't fully chosen. He spoke of his loneliness, even in a house filled with people, and eventually he revealed the conflict that haunted him most, the one tied to Priscilla. Ann-Margret would later hint that Elvis confessed things to her that he never told anyone else. What he revealed was not simple infatuation or a passing attraction. Elvis admitted that his feelings for her were real, deeper than he could ever acknowledge publicly. He was already bound to Priscilla, not just by love but by expectation. His family, his manager Colonel Tom Parker, and the public all demanded that the story end with a wedding at Graceland. But in his heart he knew that Ann-Margret had touched something he could not deny. This was the secret Elvis could never share with Priscilla. To her he played the role of the devoted fiancé, assuring her that their future together was secure. Yet when he was alone with Ann-Margret, he admitted the truth that his heart was not whole. He was torn, divided between duty and desire, loyalty and love. It was a confession of vulnerability, not the bravado of a rock star, but the honesty of a man who realized he could never fully give himself to just one woman. For Ann-Margret, these words carried both tenderness and pain. She knew the weight of what he was saying, and she also knew it placed her in an impossible position. She couldn't replace Priscilla. Elvis would never abandon the woman waiting at Graceland, but she also couldn't deny the connection they shared. It was a bond that would linger in the background of Elvis's marriage, shaping the way fans, friends, and even Priscilla herself would remember those years. In later years, Ann-Margret remained loyal to Elvis's memory. She rarely spoke in detail, choosing to protect the private moments they shared. But even the small admissions she made were enough to confirm what had long been suspected, that Elvis had confided a truth to her about his marriage, a truth he never dared admit to Priscilla's face. That truth left Ann-Margret with a secret she carried silently, that she had been the woman Elvis truly loved, even if circumstances forced him into a different life. But if Elvis's heart was divided, what did it mean for the marriage he eventually built with Priscilla? Could a union that began under that shadow ever hope to survive? That answer would become clear in the years ahead, as the weight of this hidden truth began to surface. On May 1, 1967, Elvis Presley and Priscilla Beaulieu stood together in Las Vegas and said their vows. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect moment, the king finally settling down with his longtime love, sealing the fairy tale that fans had been waiting to see. The photographs told a story of smiles, elegance, and glamour. But behind the polished image, a quieter truth lingered. Elvis's heart had already been divided. For Priscilla, the wedding was the fulfillment of nearly a decade of waiting. She had left behind her teenage years in Germany, endured years of living under the strict rules at Graceland, and had been molded by Elvis's circle into the role of a perfect bride. Yet even as she walked down the aisle, there was an unease that could not be shaken. The shadow of Ann-Margret still hung over them, a presence that neither vows nor rings could erase. Elvis, too, felt the conflict. He knew what the marriage meant for his image, for his family, and for the millions of fans who wanted stability from their idol. But he also knew the secret he had confessed to Ann-Margret, that his feelings for her ran deeper than anything he could acknowledge in public. That secret did not disappear when he kissed Priscilla at the altar. It lingered, unspoken, in the background of their life together. As husband and wife, their differences quickly became clear. Priscilla wanted intimacy, stability, and a home that felt like hers. Elvis, however, was consumed by the demands of stardom. Tours, movies, and recording sessions pulled him away constantly. When he was home, his moods shifted, sometimes tender and affectionate, other times restless and distracted. And woven into that restlessness was Ann-Margret. Even when she wasn't physically present, her memory remained. Friends noticed that Elvis often compared the two women, sometimes without realizing it. Ann-Margret had been his equal on stage, a performer who could keep up with his energy and challenge him as a partner. Priscilla, by contrast, had never shared that part of his world. She remained at home, caring for their daughter Lisa Marie, and living in the shadows of Elvis's larger-than-life career. This imbalance made it nearly impossible for her to escape the feeling that she was competing with a ghost. For Ann-Margret, stepping back was an act of loyalty. She did not want to destroy Elvis's marriage, and she respected Priscilla too much to cause a public scandal, yet her silence only made the bond more haunting. The very fact that she never spoke out, never tried to claim her place, gave her an almost mythic role in Elvis's life. The woman who remained untouchable, the love he could never fully have but never completely let go of. As the years passed, the cracks widened. Elvis and Priscilla tried to maintain the appearance of happiness, but the distance between them grew. Priscilla longed for a marriage built on devotion, but Elvis carried the weight of a secret that left him unable to give himself completely. Their home life began to reflect that fracture, and those close to them sensed that the marriage was never truly on solid ground. The truth was simple yet devastating. No marriage could compete with the memory of Ann-Margret. Priscilla had the title of wife, but she never had the reassurance that she was Elvis's only great love. That knowledge shaped their relationship from the start, ensuring that the fairy tale the public celebrated would eventually crumble. And crumble it did. But when the cracks widened into open fractures, how did Priscilla cope with the humiliation of always being compared? And what did it cost her to keep the illusion alive? In the years after their wedding, Priscilla Presley's life was shaped by contradiction. To the world, she was the chosen woman, the one who had captured Elvis's heart and secured her place at his side. She was photographed as the elegant young wife, later the loving mother to Lisa Marie. But behind the glossy images, she carried a private reality that was far more painful. Her marriage was already weighed down by the knowledge that she was not Elvis's only emotional anchor. Priscilla had always been expected to fit into a role: supportive, loyal, and silent. At Graceland, she lived within strict boundaries, overseen not only by Elvis, but also by his tight inner circle, who enforced routines and rules. While Elvis traveled, filmed, and performed, she remained at home, often left with little contact, waiting for phone calls that sometimes never came. For a young woman in her 20s, that isolation was crushing. And as the months turned into years, another wound deepened: the constant comparison to Ann-Margret. Even when Elvis did not speak her name, Priscilla felt her presence everywhere. The press still ran stories about the undeniable chemistry Elvis had shared with his co-star. Fans remembered the electricity of Viva Las Vegas and whispered about how real it had seemed. For Priscilla, every article, every photograph, was a reminder that she was being measured against a woman she could never eclipse. This silent competition cut deeply. Priscilla knew she could not match Ann-Margret's independence or professional success. She had been molded into a dependent role, shielded from pursuing her own career, while Elvis continued to shine in public. That imbalance created a painful dynamic. Elvis was celebrated for his talents, while Priscilla's value was tied almost entirely to her role as wife and mother. The more she tried to fulfill that role, the more she realized it left her unseen. Even moments of closeness with Elvis were fragile. He could be tender, even romantic, but he could also retreat into long silences, mood swings, or distractions. Sometimes he sought comfort in other women, a reality Priscilla quietly endured. Yet what stung most was not the fleeting affairs, but the memory of Ann-Margret, because she represented a love that was not temporary. Priscilla sensed that she was living in the shadow of something deeper, and no amount of devotion could erase that truth. Her response was one of endurance. She rarely confronted Elvis directly, fearing his anger or his withdrawal. Instead, she internalized the pain, presenting a composed image to the world. She smiled for cameras, supported his career, and tried to create stability for Lisa Marie. But behind that composure was a young woman struggling with loneliness, resentment, and doubt. Friends later remembered how she would confide in them about her unhappiness, though she rarely showed it in public. The cost of this silence was enormous. Over time, Priscilla's sense of self eroded. She had entered Elvis's world as a teenager, shaped by his desires and expectations, and by her 20s, she was trapped in a role that left little room for her own identity. The more she suppressed her feelings, the more distant she felt from him, and the greater the fractures in their marriage became. By the early 1970s, those fractures were impossible to ignore. The marriage that had begun under the shadow of Ann-Margret was now openly unraveling. For Priscilla, the years of silent struggle had reached a breaking point. She could no longer pretend that her marriage was whole when she had spent so long feeling incomplete. But while Priscilla was quietly falling apart, Ann-Margret was making a very different choice, one that would reveal just how much Elvis had trusted her, even after the wedding bells faded. While Priscilla carried the weight of comparison and quiet struggle, Ann-Margret chose a very different path. After the whirlwind of Viva Las Vegas, she stepped back from Elvis's life in ways that only deepened the mystery. Unlike others who might have sought fame or profit from their closeness to him, Ann-Margret protected what they had shared. She never boasted, never fed the gossip columns, never tried to insert herself into his marriage. Her silence was deliberate, and it became one of the most powerful statements of loyalty she could make. This choice was not easy. Ann-Margret had been deeply connected to Elvis, not just romantically, but emotionally. He had trusted her with his fears, his doubts, and the confession that he could never give Priscilla. Carrying that secret meant shouldering both privilege and burden. She knew that revealing it publicly would shatter lives, not only Priscilla's, but also Elvis's, who was trapped between love and duty, so she chose restraint. Her career continued to thrive in the late 1960s and 70s, but she rarely spoke about Elvis. Interviewers probed, fans speculated, tabloids circled, yet she maintained a dignified silence. When she did speak, her words were carefully measured, often filled with admiration and respect. She never diminished Priscilla, never painted herself as the other woman. Instead, she presented herself as a friend and colleague, while leaving the truth between her and Elvis untouched. This silence only fueled fascination. For decades, fans wondered what had really happened between them. Why did Ann-Margret never tell her side of the story? In a world where others sought to profit from even the smallest connection to Elvis, her refusal to exploit their bond stood out. Some saw it as proof that their connection was genuine, something too sacred to tarnish with gossip. But Ann-Margret's silence was also an act of grief. When Elvis died in 1977, she was devastated. Friends recalled that she mourned him deeply, carrying herself with quiet sorrow rather than public spectacle. At his funeral, her presence spoke louder than words. She stood among those who had loved him, honoring his memory with the same dignity she had shown during his life. In that moment, fans caught a glimpse of the depth of feeling she had carried for him all along. In later years, Ann-Margret allowed herself to hint at the truth. She spoke of Elvis with warmth, describing him as kind, generous, and deeply human. She acknowledged their closeness, but refused to betray the details. It was only in subtle comments, in fleeting admissions, that she confirmed what had long been suspected, that their bond was profound, and that Elvis had entrusted her with secrets he never shared with anyone else. That restraint has shaped her legacy just as much as her career. Ann-Margret remains not just one of Elvis's co-stars, but the woman who carried his hidden truth without ever exploiting it. Her silence was not weakness, it was a sign of respect, a choice to protect both him and Priscilla, even at the cost of her own story. And it is that silence that makes her eventual revelation so powerful. Because when she finally admitted the truth, that Elvis had loved her in ways he could never admit publicly. It confirmed everything fans had suspected for decades. The secret was real, the bond was undeniable, and it had changed the course of Elvis's life, Priscilla's marriage, and Ann-Margret's own heart. But what does this secret mean now, decades later? How does it reshape the way we remember Elvis, his marriage, and the legacy he left behind? That answer lies in the legacy of the secret itself. Decades after Elvis Presley's death, the story of his life still feels like an unfinished puzzle. Fans debate the choices he made, the pressures that shaped him, and the people who defined his most intimate moments. But at the heart of it all lies a secret carried by Ann-Margret, a confession that Elvis's marriage to Priscilla was never free of shadows. That revelation reshapes the way we understand not only his relationships, but the man himself. For years, Elvis and Priscilla's union was held up as a fairy tale. It was the image Colonel Tom Parker wanted the world to see: the young bride, the mansion at Graceland, the beautiful baby girl born into fame. But Ann-Margret's silence, and later, her subtle admissions, peeled back the illusion. The truth was that Elvis had never given himself entirely to that marriage. Part of him always belonged elsewhere, to another woman who understood him in ways Priscilla could not. This knowledge changes the narrative. It was never simply about fidelity or betrayal. It was about Elvis's struggle to reconcile two sides of himself: the man the world demanded he be, and the man who longed for authenticity, freedom, and an equal partner. Ann-Margret represented that freedom. She was his mirror, his confidant, the one who met him on level ground. Priscilla, in contrast, represented duty, the carefully chosen path that kept the story intact for fans and family. For Priscilla, the weight of this secret shaped her life long after the marriage ended. She built her own identity, raised Lisa Marie, and eventually took control of Elvis's estate. But she could never erase the knowledge that her marriage had been marked by comparison. Even in later interviews, she spoke of Ann-Margret with a mixture of respect and quiet acknowledgement, a sign that the shadow had never fully lifted. For Ann-Margret, the legacy of the secret was more private. She built a long, successful career and lived her own life, yet she never tried to cash in on the story she could have told. By choosing silence, she preserved the dignity of what they shared. That choice made her eventual revelation that Elvis had indeed confessed feelings for her he could never admit to Priscilla even more powerful. It wasn't gossip. It was confirmation from the only person who could truly know. And for Elvis, the legacy is perhaps the most complicated. His life is often remembered in extremes: the untouchable star, the tragic figure, the cultural icon. But the secret he gave Ann-Margret reveals something else entirely: a man divided, torn between love and expectation, unable to live fully in either world. It shows us the cost of being the king and the toll it took on his most personal choices. Even now, the question lingers: what would Elvis's life have been if he had followed his heart instead of the path laid out for him? Would he have found lasting happiness with Ann-Margret, or was their bond destined to remain an unfinished chapter? The answer may never be known, but what is certain is that the secret reshapes our understanding of his story. It forces us to see not just the legend, but the human being who struggled to reconcile love, loyalty, and fame. And that is the power of Ann-Margret's revelation, because it doesn't just change how we see her, or Priscilla, but how we see Elvis himself. Ann-Margret's revelation did not come in a scandalous headline or a tell-all book. It emerged slowly, quietly, in the way she chose to honor Elvis even decades after his death. She never sought to destroy Priscilla's memory of her marriage, nor to claim a greater place for herself. Instead, she revealed just enough to confirm what so many had long suspected: that Elvis's heart was never whole. He lived divided, carrying love for both women, but confessing the truth only to Ann-Margret. That secret changes the way we remember him. It strips away the illusion of the perfect Graceland story and reveals something more human: a man torn between duty and desire, loyalty, and longing. It shows that even legends are not immune to the complexities of love, and that the choices they make ripple outward, shaping the lives of those closest to them. For Priscilla, the shadow of Ann-Margret never disappeared. For Ann-Margret, the burden of silence lasted a lifetime. And for Elvis, the legacy of that secret still haunts his story. For more emotional stories, check out this video.